Okay, Bio30, so this is now going to be the next set of videos for the nervous system. We're talking about the brain. We just finished talking about the spinal cord, and we're discussing the wholesome understanding of the central nervous system. And so, with the brain, we have to understand that all brains are not created equally. Camel brain looks a little different. A cat's brain looks a little different. Dolphins' brains, you can't see it, my face is probably in the way, but that's a frog's brain. And so they look different, but you have to look at the similarities too, right? I mean, there's kind of a common sort of structure. There's this little lump at the back of the human brain and this large outer lump. The lump is a little bigger back here, and the front lump is a little bit longer looking over here in the camel's brain. Cat's brain, similar, but I can see the small lump and a big lump. Dolphin, small lump, big lump. This one's flipped. This one's facing left instead of right like the other ones. Same with this one, small lump, big lump. Um, so you might think, well, they look similar. Lumps are kind of the same, sort of, kind of, not really. And so brains are all sort of organized very similarly. Now, what parts are developed more in some organisms than a different organism is what makes that organism capable or not capable of certain things. And so I've got the central nervous system. Again, it's divided into the brain and the spinal cord. Simply put, the brain is a concentration of nerve tissue. So it's a central network of processing. And it's got a lot of nerves, and they're sort of coordinated all in one spot. And they're typically located inside of the skull for no reason besides protection, right? This is an adaptive place to put your central processing unit because it's protected by a pretty thick skull. Some guys like me a little thicker than others, right? So, and the whole point of the central nervous system is to coordinate everything, right? Your spinal cord is going to help deliver that information, but the brain is what's processing what's happening. And so, the processing of the brain's functions are divided into what we will call lobes and hemispheres. So we'll start with hemispheres. So the brain is divided into two sides, okay, a left side and a right side, and we call those hemispheres. So we've got the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So remember, we're talking about patient's left and patient's right. So like I'm facing you in a mirror image right now, but this is my left side of my brain, and this is the right side of my brain. But to you viewing, this is going to be on the left side of your screen, and this is on the right side of your screen. But right, it's not your left and right, it's the patient's left and the patient's right. Okay, so literally you can divide the human brain, or any brain really, into a left and a right hemisphere. And that's going to imply then that there's a center line, and there is a center line. And that center line is joined using a structure called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is this portion in the middle of the brain, kind of in the hemispheric equator or center of the brain, that communicates across the left side and the right sides of the brain. So it's this structure right here, okay? Cut right down the middle. Okay, so if you're right-handed or left-handed, you might think, okay, well, males tend to be more left-brained, while females may have better access to both sides. You might have heard of that, right? Men seem to be more left-brained, and if you look at left-brained things, this can be things like, I know this is a bit of a vague image, but we're talking like, so left brain tendencies tend to be things that are more artistic. Okay, so music, art, daydreaming, creativity, your perception of things, emotional regulation typically happens using the left side of the brain. And then, oh, I'm sorry, I just totally mixed this up here. The left hemisphere is in this patient because he's facing forward. I just missed that. So scrap what I just said to you, or you just saw my mouse. We'll just start this over here. There's our brain. We're facing forward. The left hemisphere is going to have language, more critical thinking, linear thinking. So writing, logic, mathematics, science. And then the right side of the brain, if you're right-brained, you're going to have more of what I just mixed up here for you so helpfully. But the right side of the brain is going to control more creative, artistic endeavors, daydream, emotional expression, artistic and music abilities, tone understanding, stuff like that. Um, Now, more often than not, but this is definitely not a rule. Men seem to be more left-brained, um, heavy. So they have more of an emphasis or more of a development in their left hemisphere. So they've got more of that linear thinking, that math, logic, writing. Now that's not to say that women don't have that. In fact, it's rather much the opposite. Men get a little shortchanged here because women tend to have better access to both sides. And so women, uh, on average, right? But this obviously there's exceptions for both sides of this, but on average, women have developed left hemispheres and developed right hemispheres. So this is why, you know, certain uh, stereotypes even of like how well men don't express emotion. Well, that honestly we could probably discuss a lot of that as social conditioning and social realities that have played a role in men maybe not expressing emotion as much, and that's something that needs to be tackled in a totally separate conversation of social bias. But um, maybe women are more better at emotional regulation and emotional expression than men because they have that part of their brain, the right hemisphere of their brain, more readily accessible than men do on average. Um, Maybe men aren't seen as creative, which again is very much so a bias that I don't necessarily agree with. And then women do because they have access to the left and right sides more than men do. But again, there's so many factors that can affect this, and it doesn't mean that you can't train yourself as like a man or woman to have a better access to one side versus the other with practice. A lot of my work with human memory and in psychology and stuff, the more you use something, right, the greater the neuronal networks, the stronger the neuronal networks get, and the better the highways and connections between different parts of the brain are. And the less you use something, the less you do something, the weaker those connections get. No different than anything else. So take this with a grain of salt, these sort of averages and these things you might have seen or heard. What I want you to really take to the bank here is that there is a left hemisphere, which tends to be more logical thinking, and there is a right hemisphere, which tends to have more creative control. Whether or not there is true gender differences or similarities, we'll leave up to research and honestly, your own opinion and your own understanding of your realities. Okay, so we can really break this down into spatial abilities, facial recognition, spatial directions, wayfinding to the right, and language, problem solving, mathematics to the left. Here's another little image you can pause on if you're interested in just general understandings of how the left and right brains are organized. Okay, so this is kind of cool. Thanks to that corpus callosum, that center point in the left and right hemispheres of the brain, you actually have a crisscross of control. And so the left hemisphere of the brain tends to control the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere of the brain tends to control the left side of the body. If it didn't have to get more complicated, there you go. Like, ironic that a person could be dyslexic and then still have their body crisscross everything it's doing all the time. So the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and then vice versa. But the brain is always combining that information and integrating that information on the proper side using the corpus callosum, that connection between the two hemispheres. So now we know that one hemisphere has one focus and the other hemisphere has the other focus through medical research, mistakes, surgeries, research gone wrong, research gone right, medical practices that were successful, and then unfortunately medical practices that were not successful. So we tried to solve seizures, which is a catastrophic electrical firing of entire parts of the brain, by cutting the corpus callosum. So if we cut the corpus callosum, research thought, well, hey, you'll kind of stop the fireworks going off in the brain during an epileptic seizure. And they did. They worked. If you cut the center corpus callosum, you were able to stop the crazy fireworks during an epileptic event. However, you also stopped communication between the left and right sides of the brain. Now, this is where it gets cool. So the split brain experiment, I would strongly encourage you to hop on YouTube or Google Roger Sperry split brain experiments. Very, very, very neat, and I can't do it justice using a PowerPoint here. But he studied patients who had had their corpus callosum cut in epileptic surgeries. He noticed that, from the front looking at them after the surgery, they could walk, they could talk, they could move around, they looked normal, they functioned relatively normally, wasn't anything crazy going on until he looked a little deeper. So this is where, if you're dyslexic like me, you might kind of mix this up at first, but let's just give this a shot. So the patient would look at a screen, and the screen had two words, the word he on the left and the word art on the right. And this is just one version of this split brain experiment. Google it. You'll see a ton of other ones which are very interesting. So the patient could only see the word he with their left eye, and they could only see the word art with their right eye. So if you were to cover up each eye, it was interesting because they couldn't integrate the information. If one eye was covered, if the right eye was covered, they were only seeing what the left eye could see. They were only seeing the word art, or sorry, the word he. And if you covered up the other eye, they could only see the word art. They couldn't see that there was both, and they weren't integrating the information between the two. The word he went to the right side of the brain, and the word art went to the left side of the brain, right? Because it's crisscrossed. So that's not even the weirdest part. Here's the weirdest part. When you ask the patient what they saw, what they saw, like you asked them, hey, well, what do you see there? They answered art. Okay, so forget about covering one eye up or not. They had two words in front of them. One was the word he, the other word was the word art. When you asked the patient what they saw, they said every single time, even though they're staring at both words, they should see both words, but they're not. They say they only see the word art. When asked to write down what that person saw, that person wrote that they saw the word he. So they have two words in front of them, one on the left, one on the right. When asked what the person saw, they said, I see the word art. When they were asked at the same time to write what you see, they wrote the word he. So there's a disconnect here. Based off of the side of the brain that's controlling the left eye or the right eye, it was dictating what that person registered they were seeing. And when they went to go write it, since writing uses a different hemisphere than seeing, they cognitively were looking or seeing or registering different things. The corpus callosum was severed, so they weren't communicating left and right sides of the brain. Chimeric faces, also a version of the split brain experiment, does something similar. So Google this stuff. If you're kind of confused and you just want to understand this better, Google it. There's some very good videos that show how absolutely fascinating this stuff is. So take a look here. Person on the left, person on the right. Person on the right was going to be seen by the right eye, so it would get registered in the left hemisphere. Person on the left would be seen by the left eye, and therefore it was going to be processed by the right hemisphere, right? Because we crisscross information. Okay, so if the patient focuses on the dot in the middle, let's put a dot in the middle. If the patient focuses on the dot in the middle of the forehead, the visual information about the woman's face will go to the right hemisphere, and the visual information about the man's face would go to the left hemisphere because of that crisscrossing information. When the patient was asked to point to a whole normal picture of the face that was just seen, the patient picked out the woman's picture. So if they asked, hey, what face do you see? Then they said, well, I see the woman's face. And when they asked the patient to say what they saw, then they said, I see a picture of a man. So when they were asked to point it out, they said, I see the woman. And when they were asked to say what they saw, they said, I see the man. And so, again, I get really dyslexic with this stuff too, so if you're confused, I'm sorry. But the point here is the brain is processing the left and the right differently, and the corpus callosum is designed to combine that information. So what the left eye sees, the right hemisphere is focusing on or processing. What the right eye sees, the left hemisphere processing, when you have the corpus callosum connecting the left and right hemispheres, you should be able to integrate that information. And what the left hemisphere does um, for spatial ability, verbal stuff, or whatever, and vice versa for the right, they should be able to combine the two and process both. But when you cut that corpus callosum, you no longer have communication, and therefore you have weird responses that are shown in these split brain experiments. So Google split brain experiments, Google Roger Sperry. It's so absolutely fascinating. A little confusing at first, but so interesting. Okay, I'm gonna just keep going on here. So meninges, what are they? Well, the meninges are the location between the brain and the skull. And so the meninges are made up of 3 layers. We mentioned this before in the cerebral spinal fluid of the spinal cord and stuff, but you've got the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Don't memorize these. Just know that there's 3 layers of a meninges. And the meninges are a protective layer for the brain and the spinal cord. So they're just a shock absorbent, basically, and they protect against infection, but sometimes the meninges themselves can get infected, which is what meningitis is, and it's very dangerous. So there's your meninges, which is a protective layer between brain and skull, right? The in-between gap is the meninges. There you go. There's a little more detail about the 3 meninges layers. So meningitis is an inflammation of the meninges caused by a bacterial or viral infection, and it can be very uncomfortable. Okay, so here's another just image of how the cerebral spinal fluid and the meninges and the brain are all organized. So if we go from inside out, you've got your brain, a mushy thing. You've got your pia mater, you've got some cerebral spinal fluid, the same stuff that's in the center of the spine. You've got your arachnoid layer and the dura mater, which make up the pia mater, make up the 3 layers of the meninges, same as in the spinal cord, and then you have the bone or the skull. Cerebral spinal fluid does the same thing in the brain as it did in the spinal cord. It's a shock absorbent, and it brings nutrients to the brain and brings waste away from the brain. If you ever have a spinal tap done, if you've heard of a spinal tap, this is where you take a very large gauge needle and you poke it into the cerebral spinal fluid between the spaces of the vertebra, and you gather a sample of that individual or that patient's cerebral spinal fluid to check it for disease or infection. Okay, in the next video here, I'm going to go through all of the different lobes of the brain.